I am a human being and I killed human beings.
Before I knew it, I'd fired 4 shots at the door. I kept on shouting for Eva to phone the police.
Tests are underway to determine if a serial killer is on the loose in Centurion, Pretoria.
The dead won't bother you. It's the living you got to worry about.
My name is Paul Llewellyn, and you are once again watching Profiler Africa right here on YouTube, or listening if you're listening to us after the live on one of the podcast platforms. Of course, we're available on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. So, yeah, make sure that you're aware, you know all the spots that we are so that you're able to catch the show every week. We do invite you to hit the like and subscribe button. The subscriptions are important. We're trying to get to 10,000 subscribers, and we're not too far off. So if you guys can help push us over the edge, that would be great. As always, I am joined by the man who was the head of forensic psychology at SAP, the forensic psychology section at SAPS, for 15, 16 years, from 2001 to 2016. 14 and a half years. Jared Labuschagne, and he is, of course, our profiler. Good evening, Jared. It's lovely to be with you. And tonight, discussing a case which you have some very kind of intimate knowledge of, in that you have sat down with the killer and spent some time with him. And we're discussing one of those cases which I think is, I don't know, when you watch true crime content on serial killers around the world, and you kind of come across the Ted Bundys and the all of these scary characters overseas, there's one guy in South Africa that seems to just have been a combination of a lot of bad people and a lot of bad things, and that is, of course, Stewart Wilken. Yeah, and that's the case we're going to be jumping into tonight. So, guys, please do join us on the chat. And if you'd like to drop any questions relating to the case, like I say, Jared has had the opportunity to sit down and interview Stewart. And so we're going to have the benefit of his fantastic insights tonight. Jared, let's jump straight into it. How did you first kind of come across this case? Because in the 90s, you weren't working at SAPS yet. You were a student, I gather. What was your first introduction to this case?
Yeah, look, I mean, his last murder was 97 January. So 97, where was I? I was busy doing my master's in psychology at the time. I think my internship, actually. So he would have been arrested when I was an intern psychologist. And I think the case was in the media, and I kind of just always knew about the case, and it was really a fascinating one just because it was just, it's kind of like our Jeffrey Dahmer to some degree. Yeah. Although, I mean, different features, but it's, I guess, in that category of type of bizarre offenders who've done really weird stuff. So I'd always known about the case. And then, fast forward, I end up in SAPS in 2001. And fast forward to 2006, I'd said to my colleague, Colonel Jan de Lange, we should go down and interview this guy. His trial is over. I can't remember exactly what the dates of his trial was. And I said, this is one guy I'd really like to go interview in prison. And we didn't really have a lot of time to do that kind of thing because we were so overwhelmed with active cases that needed to be solved. But he was at the private prison down in Bloemfontein at the time. And then Yanni and I just said, let's go do it. And then we spent sort of 2 days interviewing him, a couple hours each day. And if you watch that documentary on Showmax called Boetie, which I think is like a 5-episode series of him about his case, is really good. You'll hear a lot of that interview. It's in Afrikaans, but they have the subtitles. It's a very good documentary if you really want to know a lot more about this particular case. So yeah, and then I just had that opportunity to interview him and just found him a really fascinating guy and in all levels. He's perhaps more likely what you think, the background of a serial murderer would be like, this abused, horribly treated from a very young age, abandoned, abused by everybody in every place and everybody and everything, and then ended up becoming this vengeful, angry person who took revenge on from children to adults. So I mean, he's one of the few that has that kind of what we almost think probably most serial murderers' lives are like, which, they aren't really like that in general.
Yeah. Just a note to those folks that are watching or listening. What we're going to be doing, as you know, we've been running on Profiler on the channel on YouTube. We've been running another series called True Crime Room, hosted by Derek Reedley, and all of those episodes are now up for you to go and check out if you haven't seen them. But we're going to be starting a fresh series later in the week, a series that we call South African Serial, and we'll be dropping a 1-hour, essentially a documentary on this case that you'll be able to check out later in the week. So keep an eye on the channel for that. I think we'll be posting on Thursday night. So that'll be something to check out on Thursday. And we do interviews with the investigating officer on the case and really kind of unpack the whole story of the Stewart Wilken case. So check that out on the channel later in the week. Let's talk a little bit about Stewart's childhood. Kind of talk us through because I mean, from birth, I mean, he was essentially abandoned as a baby and found in a telephone booth. Yeah. And from there, it was pretty much, I mean, that's, not a great start. And to say it was pretty much downhill from there is quite a statement.
Yeah. I mean, I've got some notes up here. I mean, he was born in 1964 in Boksburg, in the East Rand of Johannesburg. Basically almost like abandoned immediately, and found, him and his sister were found in a public telephone booth, and sort of taken in by the people that found them. I think then was abused by those people allegedly, quite severely physically abused, being burnt with cigarettes as a little kid, had to eat food with the family dogs, etc. And then the neighbor kind of noticed this abuse and kind of then became sort of the adopted mother of Wilken. She had her own biological kids, and he also just sort of described it, though, that those kids would also, he'd get blamed for everything in the new adopted household, so also described that not sort of going particularly well, being mistreated by the siblings, etc. So yeah, I mean, not a great start off, and then he kind of struggles at school, unsurprisingly, I think, under those circumstances. Failed, I think, at least 4 times. Eventually was put into sort of like an industrial school. In the old days, industrial schools were where you put problem kids, So he was there. Of course, there he was at boarding school, continued to be abused, regularly blamed for everything, got involved in smoking marijuana, ran away, then came back. So yeah, just a really unsettled upbringing. Eventually kind of left high school, I think, with a grade 11, standard 9 in the old terminology. And then kind of was drafted into the army. And I think he was there for 3 months. And then basically after a suicide attempt, they kind of said, look, thanks, but no thanks. You don't have to finish your military service. Kind of went back to his adopted family, then learned to become a fitter and a joiner, married his first wife. And that, of course, was a big source of unhappiness for him. He would accuse her of cheating on him with policemen. He would work a lot away, and then she would kind of do things behind her back. That was also the person that he fathered his daughter with, the daughter he would have led, that he's going to later on in his life murder. So he was married twice, and I think at the time of his arrest, he was still married to the second wife. And yeah, I mean, he really kind of blamed his background and his upbringing, blamed God for what happened to him. And he said, like, when he became older, he's just going to show God to get his revenge and target children, because he was abused as a child. So he's going to target children and make them call out to God while he's doing what he's doing. And then, of course, the adult sex workers that he targeted, he kind of said, reminded him of his first wife, who he accused of, being a whore, so to speak. I don't know whether he meant that literally or figuratively. And so there's like this, he's just really trying to take control in a revengeful way upon victims that had some symbolic meaning to him, when he was a younger person. And that's kind of where it sort of snowballed, really.
Yeah. I mean, in his youth, a whole range of troubling behavior. I mean, even I read incidents of where his adopted mother had caught him committing bestiality as well at a young age.
Yeah, I think there was, allegations like that, and just quite horrific stuff. And I said we did, there were statements taken by the adopted mother who did confirm a lot of this stuff, because obviously he said a lot of these things in his initial confession, which you always have to wonder, is it true? But speaking to or interviewing the adopted mom, she did confirm a lot of this kind of background, specifically before arriving at him, that these things had happened. So it, it does appear most of it has been confirmed as being having truly what happened to him.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit about the community that he found himself in as well, because, he that part of the, for people unfamiliar with Port Elizabeth, I mean, he came from a pretty economically disadvantaged part of the city.
Yeah, look, I mean, he himself, we know when he was working, I mean, he eventually became a fisherman. You're not making a lot of money. It's very, very hard work, but you're not living the lap of luxury. So I think from childhood into his adulthood, definitely financially struggling, not living in great socioeconomic areas. So yeah, I mean, does it make him a serial murderer? No. It's going to help with your life if you're experiencing psychological stressors? Well, of course not. That's not going to make things any easier.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, we're going to jump into the first incident now. What I'm going to do as well, I'm going to just drop in. I've just put aside a couple of clips from the program, the Stewart Wilken episode of South African Serial, which I mentioned we're going to be premiering the first episode later in the week on the channel on YouTube. So here we get to meet the investigating officer on the case, and afterwards you can tell us a little bit about him as well, Gerard. So here we go.
In January of 1997, the Child Protection Unit, two detectives, female detectives, Ursula Barnard and Cherie Creer, were looking into the disappearance of a young boy called Henry Bakers. So he was about 12 years old. He disappeared on his way home from his grandparents' house to his mother's residence in a place called Algoa Park. Algoa Park's a lower socioeconomic area, and this little boy was walking, and where he was last visibly seen had been seen with our suspect Stewart Wilken, alias Boer.
Okay, so tell us a little bit about Mr. Norsworthy. Well, we seem to have lost you there, Gerard. I think Gerard has muted himself.
Sorry,
there we go.
Muted myself.
Do you know what I'm going to do?
Yes,
I'm going to get a jar. I'm going to get a jar, and we're going to drop in 10 Rand every time your mic is muted. Okay.
Fair enough. So, but that's like a tariff because you're putting the money in your jar.
Well, exactly. Tariffs are popular right now, so let's get on that bandwagon.
So, so
I'll drop the jar off at your house.
Great. Derek was a very experienced murder and robbery detective, working in Port Elizabeth, and he had done, some of the initial training by Mickey Pistorius. So I think he was one of the first guys to be trained in serial murder investigation. So a very, very experienced guy. And of course, he was roped in there by the two sexual offences or child protection unit detectives who were looking into the missing persons of one and two little kids. So, Derek was just a great investigator and had the right mindset for serial murder cases, and had obviously the right mindset for Stewart Wilken. So he was called in. So I don't think at the time the police realized there was a serial. Remember, this is pre sort of DNA, really. I mean, DNA was really only starting to show its face in 1994. And these cases were sort of 1990 up to 97. So I don't think that these were linked in any way. We didn't have a DNA database. The victimology was quite different. We had from little street children to adult sex workers, different racial groups, boys, girls. So I think it was really, if I recall correctly, only kind of once he was caught that they realized there was actually a serial potentially a serial on the go, if I recall correctly. So one of those cases that almost happened from a backwards point of view. There was no task team that was set up to investigate this particular series. Yeah.
And also he did make a point of, especially with the children, hiding their bodies so that he could return to them later. The sex workers, I guess he left more displayed and left those bodies in places that were easier to find. His first victim, who was his first victim?
So look, I mean, Stewart was, he confessed to 12 murders actually, and I'm jumping ahead a bit. He was ultimately convicted on 7, but he spoke about many more, that from the age of 18 he was committing murders. he would steal a ski boat and then dump the bodies out in the sea, which I think that just sounded a little bit too fantastic for me. To every time he's stealing a sea, killing someone, how do you transport them to the docks? Then you've got to steal a ski boat, get out, drop the body, come back, and then repeat that whole process next time. So I do think he was very good chance he was exaggerating about the overall number. But his first murder was when he was a 26-year-old. So that was a 16-year-old boy, was a street kid, which I think he sort of also propositioned for sex. I don't think he was ever identified, actually, because if I look at my list of people, there's no.
Montefico was his name.
Okay, that could be all right. That could be.
Yeah.
So
that's what I had in the documentation. Anyway, I stand to be corrected. Correct. I'm sure the audience the guys watching will correct me if we're inaccurate on that.
So he was found on the property of a school in PE, and again, they approached him for sexual favors for a small fee, and then I think basically started to sodomize him, which I don't think was part of the discussion, and strangled him. So his main preferred method of killing people was strangulation, and he actually said he enjoyed the look on his victims' faces as they were kind of going through the sort of death rattle or death sort of as your body sort of as you start to die, and that sort of helped him give these sort of powerful orgasms. So that was the first one, yeah. So Feb 1990, and then we kind of a couple months later we have the next one taking place. Oh, now you're muted. Oh, $10 in the jar.
How sweet is justice tonight, Gerard? Hey, it's
Absolutely.
Beautiful. Yeah. I muted because I was typing a hello to everyone. Let's say hello, everyone. Drop your questions on the chat if you're joining us. I've got a clip from Detective Norsworthy on this.
His victim was a young boy. He described him as 8 to 9 years old. I believe we did find out he was a bit older, 12 to 14, but he said he picked him up in the Sydenham area near a cafe, and the young boy offered himself to him for sex. He said he was having sex with the guy, and the little boy started to complain and moan. At that point, he decided to strangle him. He said obviously when he strangled him, then he ejaculated, and that was part of his modus operandi. He would say to us he couldn't ejaculate if he wasn't physically strangling the life out of the person, because it made him feel like he was a god, and he was in absolute control. And if you look at the science, a lot of these guys are totally out of control. So I think it's the only time in his life when he felt he had some form of control over the situation, and this poor little boy doing to him what had been done to him as a kid.
Okay, I mean, disturbing. I'd like to take the opportunity to just unpack some of this with you. His sexual proclivities. The fact of the matter is that he has children, and he has relationship, a normal relationship with a woman, and he's, they're having sex, they're popping out kids. So he's able to be sexually aroused and to kind of fulfill his sexual, that works. And at the same time, he's got this very twisted sexual, what becomes a habit, I guess, as well. I mean, can you just unpack some of the psychology here? I mean, let's dig into your psychology brain a bit, Gerard, and talk to us a little bit about what's going on in this man's mind.
Yeah, look, I mean, if you look at the victims, we have, at least one or two that are prepubescent, kind of generally 13 years or younger. So definitely we would start to look at concepts like pedophilia, because they would objectively kind of meet those criteria. Now, pedophiles are not only necessarily attracted to children. So when you kind of make the diagnosis of pedophilia, you have to specify, exclusive in the sense that they're only attracted to children, or non-exclusive, meaning that they have sex with adults and children. Now, that doesn't mean you're less of a pedophile. It just means that you can have sex with adults and children. So, I mean, he would then fit into that particular category. As you pointed out, he had, at least 3 children. He'd adult relationships, adult sex workers, etc. But definitely that the younger children would start to make us consider about the concept of pedophilia in his particular instance. And I mean, that's not the only what we call paraphilia. I mean, he had necrophilia, because he was having sex with some of the dead victims. So, it's not unusual if a person has one of these paraphilias, which is kind of the broad umbrella of less frequent sexual interests. Pedophilia is one of them, and it's not uncommon to find a second or a third one in someone who you've picked up has one.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, all right. Shall we move on to the next victim then?
Yeah. So this would have been Virginia Geisman, I think. She was 25-year-old, a sex worker, and this was at a primary school. I guess primary schools were just easy places to go with a sex worker, because obviously these people, the worst sex workers, were all approached on the street, as far as I recall. So yeah, or did it have some symbolic reference? Primary school, place where he experienced horrible things himself when he was at school. That could be. I mean, one can theorize about that if you want to. And yeah, so she was 25 years old, so much older than his previous victim. And again, it was sort of strangulation. So he basically strangled all of his victims. There was only one which we'll get to a bit later, where he used a knife, although he had a knife present with him during all the incidences. Manual strangulation, meaning with his hands, was what he preferred in these cases.
Okay. All right. I mean, what I think we'll do is we'll just jump through the different counts as we have them, and then we can discuss and kind of unpack some of the issues around them. Next up, we were aware of, again, he did say that he committed a number of acts, but the next that we have is January 1991, 37-year-old Mercia Pappenfuss, St. George.
Yeah. So this is St. George's Park, which is sort of a big sort of park in that area. And if I'm not mistaken, there were a couple of bodies found there. Let me just, at least two, if I have a quick glance. So this would have been very easily discovered, like the previous two at the two schools. Not much effort to hide it. This apparently was a park where people would often go with sex workers to do the transaction. Strangled her and left her kind of pretty much where anybody could find.
Yeah. His crimes were in a fairly small geographical area, from what I understand. It was kind of 5 to 10 kilometer kind of square of Port Elizabeth. So very much committing crimes in a area that he felt comfortable in, that he felt safe in.
Yeah, I mean, there's all in somewhere close to his routine activity areas, and that's very common with serial murderers across the world. We call those comfort zones. So there would usually be two comfort zones. The one where he meets his victims might be the same general area, and then the place where he takes his victims to commit the crime tends to be this nice sort of grouping of cases. And that's kind of one of your easiest and quickest warning signs that you have a serial, is that you have one or two or three or four rapes or murders occurring in that relatively small geographical area. And again, if you don't have your own vehicle and you are on foot, you just can't really travel a very wide range. So you tend to kind of keep it very close by. As soon as a serial murderer or serial rapist has a vehicle, you suddenly get much broader areas of operation. So that kind of pattern of behavior, is not really uncommon for our serials here and, of course, overseas.
Did he use any substances?
Look, he definitely was using cannabis, and I think he was also smoking, if I get it now, what people smoke, mandrax,
okay.
if I'm not mistaken. And he had previous convictions, I think in the 80s, for possession of cannabis. So definitely substances, alcohol, in and around the time of the incidences.
As I understand, his first stint in prison was a 6-month cannabis charge, in fact.
I think I've actually got that here. Possession of dacha, 1984, and then damage to vehicles' tires in 1987. So, yeah.
Started small. Okay, well, let's go to some questions. We'll take from MB first. Jared, can you speak to his tendencies as he targeted such a broad range? How would one identify a perpetrator like this? Warning signs or things not quite right? What made him switch methods?
Yeah, look, I mean, I don't know how easy it is to identify. I mean, nowadays, to link the cases that it's the work of one person, hopefully, I mean, DNA, nowadays we're probably in such a case where it's such a broad range of victims. Unless it's kind of picked up by the media, which we sometimes would have before the cops kind of realize there's possibly links. We have media saying, a bunch of people murdered, could it be a serial? Sometimes they're actually right before the cops have even realized that. So the linkage is always going to be a problem, specifically when you have from kids to adults, sex workers, non-sex worker children, etc. So, but the broadness, we haven't had a lot. I mean, the Modimolle serial murderer had adult rape victims and then children. Trying to think off the top of my head, the Schluzi serials had from little kids to adults. So we have had those from time to time. It's not the most frequent. That we do find that serials prefer to kind of stick to a particular range and gender of their victims. But yeah, so what else was there? Was part two, I think, to the question?
Part
warning
two was,
signs.
were there warning signs or things not quite right?
You know what?
Made him switch methods?
There's not going to be warning signs. These guys just aren't telling people about their pre-murder fantasies. They're not going into those things with people. And behaviorally, so many other people have behavioral problems and issues that, we'd be treating, for every 5,000 we're treating badly, maybe one of them might be a serial. So, or judging, this person might do something horrible. So, there's not really going to be your classic pathway in terms of behavior during school and behavior kind of after school that we can say all serials walk that pathway. Therefore, if you see this, that is someone on that serial pathway. No, the things that they're going to be exhibiting are kind of just generally not great behavior, but nothing that's going to be specific to serials. And that's part of the frustrations about trying to identify this earlier. Unless someone is telling you about their incredibly violent fantasies they have, you're probably not going to be able to find out about it.
Yeah, although, I mean, Stewart's just general, he had a chaotic childhood. So, I mean, and did display, like we discussed earlier, a lot of disturbing behaviors. So, I mean, I guess warning signs, but there's no accurate formula yet, is there?
Look, I mean, displaying signs that I think if we see them, any child should probably be assisted. Yeah. I mean, any child who is, acting out, hurting animals, I mean, whether they're going to become a serial later on in life, who knows, but they should probably be getting some kind of professional assistance for whatever issues they're dealing with. Yeah. But to say and predict this one is going to walk the path of a serial, it's like literally impossible.
Do we, where is the science going on this? Do we anticipate there being a time where we get closer to those kinds of answers? I mean, do you think that is a feasibility?
I'm not sure whether we will. I mean, if it is, it might come from the science of genetics. I just don't think that from a psychology point of view, we're going to get to the origins or the pathways. Yeah, maybe there's something different. I think the problem is overseas, in America and places like that, a lot of these people are put to death, or there's you can't study them. So that is always going to be a barrier to doing large scale research on the genetic aspects and brain imaging aspects. Yeah, absolutely. To be able to say we've scanned 80% of the living serial murderers, and we've taken DNA samples, and this is what we found. Yeah. That's just not going to happen. You just don't get access to these people from research point of view. And even when I was doing my master's and my doctorate, and I mean, as a master's student, I mean, not even a qualified psychologist, and I would be speaking to overseas people and like quite experienced in the field, and they're like, "You're allowed to interview serial murderers during your master's dissertation studies," and they just couldn't believe it. So that was kind of one of the advantages of the little research we have in South Africa. It's directly involved with these people, but you just don't get that kind of access overseas once they're convicted.
I mean, it doesn't seem like a bad idea to have, when you get to a certain level of academia, if you're at your kind of master's, if at doctorate level, say, it does seem like a good idea to have, those kind of engaged young minds having that opportunity.
Yeah, look, I mean, if I look back at the studies I did for my master's and my PhD, it was before I was working in the field, I completed my PhD in 2001, and at the end of 2001, I joined the police. I mean, I don't even want to tell people about my master's and doctorate. I don't even want to refer people to go read it, because if I'd done that 5 years after starting work in the police, I would have done something that was really helpful, meaningful, and less naively done, and would it be more practical? And that's the downside. People are doing this when they got like zero actual, even just psychology experience, let alone any insight into the field, because you just haven't worked with it. So, yeah.
Okay. Let's take another question from Unini else. Good evening. How do professionals differentiate between mental illness and pure criminal intent in cases like this?
Yeah, look, I mean, he was sent for observation, if I recall correctly. I think Prof. Szabo, a very well-known psychiatrist, his son is also a Prof. Szabo psychiatrist. But the older Prof. Szabo had assessed him. I think he had classified him as a psychopath, if I'm not mistaken. So you'd typically have these people sent for observation to determine at the time of the incident was their mental health issues influencing their behavior. So, that's quite typically easy to diagnose from interviewing the person, getting some background information, etc., looking at how the crime was committed. So these serial murderers in South Africa and across the globe are almost never mentally ill. Now, that doesn't mean that they're normal, don't get me wrong, but this is not, voices as part of schizophrenia, psychosis that's causing them to go out and commit these acts, at least not the ones we've had here in South Africa. So ruling out the mental illness, things like that, is quite easy. As I said, are they normal? Clearly not. I mean, normal people don't do this, but is it driven by some uncontrollable mental health problem? No. Even if they are diagnosed as a psychopath, which not all of them are necessarily, the overwhelming majority of psychopaths aren't killing people, let alone multiple people. They might be unpleasant people. They'll be robbing, cheating, swindling, or even not breaking the law, but just not very nice people. But they're not doing this kind of stuff. So even psychopathy is not an explanation for serial murder at all, in any sense of the word.
I want to ask you about the man himself and about meeting him and about your impressions of him, etc. But let's give Detective Norsworthy the opportunity to do that. I'd like to remind everyone to please subscribe to the channel, and we are doing our best to get to 10,000 subscribers as quickly as possible. So, tonight, just, share with a friend and ask them to subscribe. Okay, guys, do that for us and help us get to 10,000, and it's going to make our lives bringing you weekly content just that much easier, step by step, bit by bit. Later in the week, we're going to be premiering a new series on the channel called South African Serial. The case that we'll be covering is this one, and this is another one of the clips taken from that episode.
When I walked into the room was never that, you never walk in and say, I'm dealing with a serial killer. You didn't know at that stage. You're dealing with a potential sex offender. He looked quite disheveled. It was obvious to me he was potentially living on drugs. A lot of the guys in the fishing community use cannabis as a normal day-to-day survival. The conditions of living on the water really bad. And he had created this persona amongst the people that he called himself some alter ego, Boetie Boer. So he was living in the predominantly colored community, and that colored community is very gang-orientated. And obviously for a white guy, that would create quite a bit of fear. And also because he was married to a colored lady, he wasn't always well accepted in the community. So he had to look after himself, and that was part of this persona I saw when I walked in. But yes, when you walk in, you're apprehensive, you don't know what to expect, you don't know where it's going to go. For me, in the end of the day, it's about getting the result. We had a missing boy, we didn't have a body. We had parents that were distraught, and he had a past history that was being explained of sexual misfunction. So, I mean, for me, the first thing was to create rapport. Someone's not going to pour out their heart to you if they don't trust you. I don't ever think the trust we talk about is similar to the trust you have in a marriage after 20 years. But I think a lot of serial killers get to the point where they want to talk.
Okay. And he was not a character that didn't talk. I'm gonna ask you to reflect on your memories of meeting him and tell us a little bit about the man. And I'm gonna add a little comment into that from Arena Van Tunda, who says, jealous of the opportunity to have interviewed him. Please share one of the most memorable and fascinating moments or statements shared during this interview. So let's talk a little bit about meeting the man, Gerard.
Yeah, because he was, like many of these guys, sort of very unassuming. They're not what you expect from having mean, the only thing we know about them before we meet them is their crimes, which are obviously horrific. But they don't present that way when you actually meet them in real life. He was kind of shortish, little chubby guy at that point in time. Not to be mean, he's not the most intellectual person, if I can put it that way. He kind of says things in a plain kind of fisherman way, very bluntly and directly, and calls a spade, and very unassuming, kind of like, I don't want to say pathetic, just like not what you would expect. So that was kind of always what it was like when you'd meet these guys. And every time I told myself, don't be surprised by that, I'm surprised by it. And I said, that's because you're starting to know him from only his crimes, and then you get to meet the person. And I always say that serial murderers spend only a tiny portion of their lives killing people. Very tiny. I mean, if you take it that, let's say that he said he killed 12 people, and let's say he did kill 12 people, and each one of those crimes from start to finish was an hour. That's 12 hours of his life. It's not even it's 1.5 work days. So the rest of the time they're doing all the boring, mundane junk that we all do. So we have far more in common with them than we don't. And that way it's easy to kind of relate to them. Other moments during the incidences, I mean, obviously he would just speak he wasn't boasting, but he would be very sort of nonchalant and casual about describing the things that happened. And he was very detailed about what he did. Wasn't boasting, like I said, but you can just clearly see that this wasn't as horrific to him as it was to the rest of us. I guess the other moment, which was quite interesting, was, of course, when he spoke about one of the cases we're going to discuss next, which involved mutilation of the body. And it's the only victim that he actually mutilated almost like as an experiment. And he was describing that and how he ate the various body parts that he cut off. And I remember asking him, so what did that taste like? And I won't repeat that on here. In case you enjoyed that food.
He did respond. Okay.
Yeah, he did respond, and it had a kind of, he said it, and then I think we both had a chuckle. It was just kind of one of those weird, funny moments, I guess you can say.
Yeah, it doesn't get much more macabre than that, does it? Let's talk about that case. The next victim was Georgina Zweni, yes, whose body was discovered in July 1995. She was 42 years old, and she was found at Prince Alfred Park.
Yeah. So yeah, and I just want to say, also with that interview, I mean, and I really appreciate that he was prepared to speak to us and be so open and honest, because that was also a great education opportunity for myself and Yanni to get these insights. And a lot of these guys don't want to talk about these things and don't want to talk about all the embarrassing things. So, I'm until today very appreciative of the fact that he was prepared to speak to us. But yeah, so we got Georgina Zweni. So as I said, this is really interesting because he strangled her with her clothing. And then he said afterwards he kind of just wanted to experiment. So he took his fisherman's knife, which was always an incredibly sharp thing, sort of probed the stomach, stabbed a few times. So this wasn't involved in the killing process. This was all pretty much after she was dead and after he'd obviously raped her. And then, I don't know what the order was, but he cut off the nipples and the external part of the vagina. That's what he ate at the crime scene. And he afterwards said he actually wanted to cook it, but he didn't have that opportunity. So that's the only regret he had about doing the way that he did it. And then he said he wanted to sort of feel inside a woman's vagina, and he actually inserted his whole hand and was sort of, I guess, must have been touching the womb, etc., and try to pull it out. And he said he couldn't. So a lot of that was just this curiosity experimentation, which you just sometimes see stuff that's really weird at one particular scene that you don't necessarily see then reoccurring at any of the others. Because I mean, after that, there was still at least three more that he was convicted of. 2 kids and a 22-year-old sex worker. So, but he didn't do that kind of stuff ever again, as far as we know, with any victims that we're aware of.
Yeah, and we've got a comment from Norsworthy on this as well.
This victim, he both cut her nipples and a sexual organ and committed picarism, which is stabbing into the stomach area repeatedly. The The psychologists can tell you a bit more about that and why they do that, but our understanding is that in the mental state, they're trying to get back into the womb. Whether that's true or not, I don't know, but these were the actions that he performed. Quite funny in this case, when we were reviewing it together and discussing it with his lawyer, at one point he said, you know, Derek, you like the smoothing, and you like this good look, the chicks like you, but you've never cut a woman's sexual organs apart and eaten it.
Yeah. So, I mean, kind of rings true as well, I guess, from the interview with Norsworthy, was the fact that, you know, he was very candid about his actions when he started to talk. Talk a little bit about this idea of picarism that was brought up in that clip as well.
Yeah, look, I mean, to make that statement, you'd have to know whether it was for him a sexual process of the stabbing, and really picarism is sort of this sexual arousal from stabbing or poking, you know, into the skin of another human being. So yeah, I mean, if it was sexual, then it might be under the category of picarism. You know, you'd usually expect that if it is going to be picarism, that it would be occurring in a lot more contexts. So we don't know, firstly, he never said to me, I don't recall him saying to me that he was sexually aroused by that. But that is a possible explanation for him doing that. But as I said, you probably then would have seen this happening with other victims, unless it was just the experimentation on that particular body. And so they say like people like Jack the Ripper did this, and Andrei Chikatilo from Russia apparently also kind of did that.
Okay. And then we just have a question from Nicole, and we've covered it a little, but let's look at it specifically. What is the psychology behind cannibalism?
I don't know if I got a good answer for that, to be honest with you. Look, I mean, it's anything from old cultural practices, certain parts of Polynesian islands that used to be a practice with regards to your enemies, or sometimes it was even just a purely survival thing. You know, I think for modern day, where it's not a survival thing and it's really people who do this because they want to in Western society. I mean, again, there's going to be lots of theories. You know, the psychological theories talking about it's keeping the victim as permanently part of you, that they can never leave you. So I think Jeffrey Dahmer kind of had that view about it, because if you eat the person, what you eat is what you become. So you carry that victim with you all the time. So I think it's going to be very individual. I think there's going to be lots of different reasons why people would do it. And of course, if you ask someone who's a Freudian psychologist, I can guarantee you they're going to wangle a penis into the explanation. And if you listen to someone's behaviorist, they'll say it was learned behavior. Yeah, I don't know.
I mean, there's definitely, though, that aspect of just experimenting, of, just doing different things. It's I've got a different victim. I've got a new opportunity. I'm going to try out some new stuff.
And people often think that, in this case, when I always talk about this case to students, they often think that, this is a sexual behavior. I don't typically know that cannibalism is linked to sexual arousal. If it was sexually arousing for him, and that's why he did it, then you might say, is it a paraphilic kind of behavior? But if it wasn't, if it was just, I wanted to know what it tastes like, and there's no sexual arousal, then we wouldn't classify it in the category of paraphilic behavior.
Okay, on to the next victim then. And this is a sad, this is a terrible one. And I think really does speak to the depth of, just darkness that Stewart went to. And this would be Wane Wilken, his daughter. Tell us a little bit about this incident, Jared.
Yeah, she wasn't living with him. He kind of had a suspicion that she was being sexually abused by the mother's boyfriend, and she came over to his house, or he picked her up and brought her back to his house and then inspected her and came to the conclusion that she was being abused. And then he kind of decided that he didn't want her to have the life that he had as someone who was sexually abused, and then decided to kill her, to, I guess in his view, in his description, an altruistic murder, because saving this person from a life of being abused. And I think her body was found naked, if I recall correctly, and he vehemently denied that there was any sexual interaction, at least at the crime scene or during the murder, with his daughter. I don't know. Unfortunately, she was quite skeletonized, as you saw, so we're not really sure. If you look at the rest of his murders, they were all sexual. So you kind of wonder. But he vehemently denied that. And so she was, a little 10-year-old girl.
It is the case so that he would return to the child victims in particular. Is that correct? So although he may not have admitted to committing sexual acts upon her, he was returning to the body post-mortem.
Yes, I actually have a quote here where he said, "I had sex with some of the dead bodies, then I can have my ecstasy. Then I can do things the way I wanted to. There's no screaming and chaos. I would fantasize about the murder and masturbate at the body also." When I asked what type of sexual acts, he said, I quote, "I had sex with them. I took condoms because of the dead body. They're cold. That's why I used condoms with the dead bodies. I also didn't throw the condom away there, somewhere else. I didn't use a condom when I killed them, though. I was a sex maniac. I did what I want with the victim. If they didn't comply, I hit them. What bothered me was the begging. I hit a blank. I'm not myself. And then afterwards, I realized what I've done." So, yes, I mean, going back, again, it's not common, it's not unheard of, but it's not a common feature. I'm trying to think if I've had other serial murderers in South Africa where they engage in necrophilia. I can't really think that I actually have, to be honest with you. You might have people who go back and masturbate at the scene, but having sex with the dead bodies, off the top of my head, I don't remember anyone else that I've had that actually did that.
Okay. Then his final adult victim that we're aware of, Katrina Claassen, from May 1996. She was 22 years old.
Yeah, so I mean, if you look at it, just at the span of these murders, so we had Feb 1990, October 1990, Jan 1991, October 91, July 95. So he kind of jumps, although we think there were other murders that were committed by him, he was not guilty on those ones. So we kind of have this jump from 91 to 95, and then another one, 95, 96, 96, 97, January. So quite a span.
Yeah.
And like I always say, we don't know if that was everything. There were other ones he was suspected of, like I said, that he wasn't found guilty of. And of course, because this was pre-DNA, there could be even other ones that he successfully murdered that just weren't linked for whatever reasons, or they were just outside of an area, etc. So,
I mean, it must be very unlikely that there were no victims between 1991 and 1996.
Yeah, I find that very, very unlikely.
Yeah. So there's maybe would it be feasible? Would an exercise be feasible in looking at cases from that period, in retrospectively, to see if any of the cases on record there might have a line to any of Stewart's behaviors?
I'm pretty confident that Derek and them would have tried to do a search in, I guess, a reasonable geographical area for any adult sexual murders, because these would have presented themselves as sexual murders because you have the victims completely or partially naked. So I've little doubt that they would have done that in the immediate area. But of course, if he had moved, a little bit further out, beyond the area that they were kind of focusing on for further bodies, then we could have had stuff. And like I said, there were other ones intermittently that he was found. I mean, I'm just looking at the not guilty list: October 91, September 93, and then 96. So at least two others in 91 and 93 that they thought were, one at St. George's Park, a young boy, for whatever reason, not guilty on those ones. So yeah. I mean, and as I said, he spoke about having other bodies that he took out and dumped at sea, which for me was practical and very impossibly impractical to have done, but he claims to have done. I see also, with regards to the victims, he told me that he would go back to the daughter's grave, because obviously her body wasn't found for a long time, as you saw from the skeleton pictures. And he said he spoke to the daughter, asked for forgiveness, and placed her clothes over her body. And again, the question comes back to, well, why were her clothes off her body if you say this was nothing to do with a sexual... Because when he looked and checked to see if she'd been abused, that apparently he did at his house. Then he took her to, I think this was behind, the Holiday Inn Happy Valley, I think it's called. Then he also says, Henry, which is the last victim, which is the little boy, and one of the small street children, I went back and asked for forgiveness, and I had sex with the bodies of the children when visiting them. That's what he said. But again, denies anything sexual with his daughter.
Okay. On to the last victim then, and this is the victim essentially when he was caught. He'd actually visited, from what I understand, the body just that day or within the previous day of him being caught. Let's talk about that last case, the case of Henry Backers then.
Yeah, so this little boy was, I think, his ex-girlfriend's son. So he was quite known to the family. I think they'd broken up. And he arrived, I think, at the place where this boy was. And then he was supposed to go back to his granny. And it was getting late. And Stewart said, well, I'll take him back. And then according to him, remember, this is all, we only have Stewart's version of events, is that while they were walking, the boy Henry started to ask about sex, and he said there's a girl that wants to have sex with him. Remember, hey, Henry was 12 years old. And then Boetie said to him, well, have you ever done that before? And let me show you. And then basically took him into the sort of overgrown foresty area, whatever you call it, and then basically forced himself upon Henry and strangled him. And that's kind of because he was the last person seen walking, leaving the house, going to the granny's house, supposed to have dropped him off. Then he became suspect number one. And he was, as I understand, brought in basically because of that missing child. And then expertly interviewed by Derek Norsworthy, and then kind of spilt the beans on just about all the cases.
Yeah. I mean, this one is particularly harrowing, I find, and it's, when I reflect back on the case, this is the one piece of information that really kind of just sits badly in my stomach, is the fact that he'd been back to this body and sodomized the corpse, like I say, just that morning. And when I showed the photo, I'm not going to show it again, but, when you actually consider the state of decay, that the state that body was in, for him to go back and commit that act on that body, it's just insane.
Terrific.
Terrific.
And he said that he would insert like toilet paper to try and block. I don't want to get too graphic, what he was hoping to keep out or in.
Well, to stop bugs from being in certain orifices, wasn't it? If we...
Yeah. The other sort of interesting behavior, he would take a lot of the victims' if you like, the victims' underwear. So basically, if they were nice G-strings, he said, or a thong if you're from other parts of the world, he would keep them for a month or two between his clothes. He would then lay them out in the bed and masturbate and fantasize about them while doing that. And then after a couple of months, he would sort of burn the clothes. So he was keeping that sort of souvenirs or trophies. Again, I haven't seen that a lot with our South African serials, but it's something that's quite noted in the literature about serials keeping souvenirs, which is just like a reminder, or a trophy, which is something that you kind of almost display where you stay or wherever.
Will you just talk us through how he was actually apprehended? What was it that led the police ultimately to his door?
Yes, as I remember correctly, it was because of the fact that he was the last person seen with Henry, and Henry had disappeared. And I think I'm trying to recall whether they'd found the body at that point. But anyway, Derek, as I said, was called in to help with the interview because he had been trained at that point in weird crime investigation, which was, of course, included a lot of the serials, and sort of just said to him, how many times did you go back to this body? Also said that Stewart also said that Derek treated him very decently. Firstly, that's always a good start. During the interview, didn't threaten, didn't hurt him, didn't call him horrible names. I remember Stewart also said that he had seen a picture of, I think in Derek's office, of a drawing that Derek's children had done, or child had done. And basically then, as I said, Derek, with his knowledge of serials, kind of said to him, almost like out of the blue, how many times did you go back to the body? And he was like shocked that anybody would even know that or think that. And those are the kind of things that made him then open up and then basically started to tell Derek about a bunch of things. And that's really, as I said, how the serial came out. And then that led to Stewart doing a pointing out, which is where he would take someone to the various locations and indicate what he'd done, where he'd done it, to whom he'd done it to, which is great from an evidential point of view.
I'm going to interject there because we've got our final clip from the episode that we'll be posting on the channel this coming Thursday evening, and that will be our first episode of a series called a South African serial killer, and the first episode will be focused on this, the Stewart Boetie Boer Wilken case. And here he is talking about Stewart agreeing to do the pointing out. Don't worry, Gerard, that was the best time to let me show myself. That was the best time to be muted there, Gerard.
I was hoping you were going to get to the video and I would sneeze without anybody seeing.
I was going to play it quickly, but here we go. Let's jump in.
He agreed to do a pointing out, which is basically we get police officers who are not involved at all in the investigation, and then he would take them and go and show them where the body of the deceased was. He insisted, which was quite dangerous from a court and a legal perspective, he insisted I go with. So generally, I mean, the investigator or the interrogator does not go with. But in this case, I did. He was saying he was scared they were going to kill him and they were going to shoot him and all this. So no one's going to hurt you, I'll go with you. So I eventually went with on the pointing outs. Those kind of scenes of crime you never forget. This little boy was maggot infested. He'd been dead for about 5-6 days at the point. He'd been left in a very humid, hot area where there's a lot of reeds and water. So his body was in a far extent of decomposition compared to what we would have expected at the time. And I just recall when we were taking him out of the reeds, just throwing up and vomiting. It's one of the worst things I've ever seen in my life. So.
Sure. Okay, so you'll be able to catch that full episode later in the week on the channel. So please do check that out. But yeah, just harrowing accounts from Derek, and he went through the pointing out. We've got some images to talk through the pointing out as well. Gerard, you are muted, I believe. So I think you have muted yourself. So there we go.
Yes.
Let me bring up some of the pointing out images, and then we can talk a little bit about the pointing out.
Mm.
So,
right,
so like Derek said, he was asked to. Stewart actually, you mentioned that that Derek had established a really great rapport with Stewart, and Stewart only felt comfortable to go do the pointing out with Derek there, which is not typical.
Yeah. So basically the procedure for pointing out is if you're interviewing them and they're starting to tell you what happens, you ask them, are you prepared to show these things and tell these things to someone else? And this will be an officer, meaning someone with a rank of an officer. So typically lieutenant captain, major, colonel upwards, who had no involvement in the investigation. And that's why I said for Derek to be there is a bit risky. The point of having an officer who was not involved in the investigation is because he doesn't have pre-knowledge about the case. So if you want to say, but this investigator just took me to the crime scenes. Well, how do you prove that isn't the case? But if you have, as I said, a person who had no involvement in the case, it's more difficult to have the accusation that I was just taken to these scenes by this detective. So that's why having Derek present could potentially be a problem for that. In the same way that the photographer taking the pictures would not have wouldn't have been allowed to be someone who was actually at the crime scenes, who was the crime scene photographer, because again, it's contamination of the knowledge. So I think in this case, it was him almost saying, I'm not going to do it unless Derek comes with me. And then you have to weigh up. You either don't have a pointing out at all, or you have one that you try and justify, if necessary, in the court proceedings. So I don't think it's wrong. If that's the only way it's going to happen, that's the only way it's going to happen. And of course, if you're very lucky, he points out bodies that you haven't even discovered yet, which of course is even better evidence. And how would that body have been discovered by the police if it hadn't been discovered yet? Yeah. So that's in a nutshell. So it's really a confession with behavior linked to it. So it's really, in my opinion, better than a normal confession, because they're displaying of active locations to people.
Yeah.
So that's, of course, only meaningful if the person does not plead guilty. Because obviously if someone is going to plead guilty at the trial, then a whole guilty plea is drawn up with their lawyer in terms of the Criminal Procedure Act. And then you don't need to present that stuff. So pointing out some confessions are only relevant if the person pleads not guilty. And then you introduce those as, well, at a previous point in time, this person admitted to these various things. They will challenge it by saying, but I was threatened, I was assaulted. There will be a trial within a trial to confirm whether or not this was free and fair. If it was free and fair, it's admitted as very damning evidence against the person.
Sure. I think we can go to some of the questions now, Gerard. From Pierre, was he intellectually impaired in any way?
I wouldn't say so. I mean, he didn't strike me as the brightest pixie in the forest. But he wasn't, like, I wouldn't say he's, in old terminology, mentally handicapped. I think he just kind of was average, a little bit on the lower of the average side. So nothing that would, again, affect his ability. And if there was something like a severe intellectual disability or learning disability, or whichever term you prefer, that is something that would have been looked for at the competency to stand trial and criminal capacity assessment.
Okay. From Mariana, why did he pose them so dramatically? And I guess this really relates to the female victims more than anything else. Although, I mean, his first victim was also.
Yeah. Look, I mean, I didn't see that as dramatic posed. I think they were kind of left, for me, a large degree, however the body was when he finished with it, he left the body. He wasn't then manipulating them afterwards. I didn't get the impression that he afterwards then put them in specific positions to have an effect, and he didn't mention it. So, the victims typically, after you've raped and murdered them, are lying on their back. If there'd been more clear consistency, like the one little boy his legs were clearly like out to the side and down. If they'd all been very clearly like that and there was more consistency, then one would start to wonder, was he posing them afterwards to have a particular impact? But I think for the most part, these were just pretty much how they were when he was finished with them. Yeah.
When his daughter went missing, how did he react? Did he just go along with the idea that she was gone? And then from Helen, did no one look for his little girl? So, I mean, I do understand that he was considered a suspect in the disappearance of his daughter, that they were aware of her disappearance.
Yeah, no, look, I mean, the mother, I think, the same day reported her as missing, and that's how Sherry Kruger and the other child protection investigator lady that was involved started the whole looking for 1A, and then of course Henry Buckers. So those were missing persons basically that they'd started looking for.
Yeah, I'd like to thank Carmen for the super chat. We really do appreciate it. If you'd like to drop us a super chat, contribute to the show, you're welcome to do so. I also encourage you to become a member of the channel. We do post exclusive content in the members area that you can check out, and you're also contributing to the development of an alternative media channel in Profiler Africa. All right, let's see, what other questions have we got here? Never Clicked So Fast becoming one of my favorite true crime
I think Helen's
channels.
got a good one.
Gosh, how did investigators and profilers survive this? Was one question from Helen. Was that the one, Gerard?
I think like with any job, that's one,
Okay.
but that's a good one. That's not the one I was thinking of. But
Okay, fine.
how do we survive it? I think if you're not, every job you have to have an aptitude for, whether you're an accountant, a teacher, a mechanic, psychologist, profiler. And it's got nothing to do with intellectual level. I mean, I might have the IQ to be an accountant, but my God, I couldn't do that. It would be soul destroying. I'd be depressed. I'd want to probably end my life. So I think you have to have the right kind of aptitude, for lack of a better word, a right mindset, that you see it as something. I always saw it as amazing research opportunities. I saw every case I worked on was a research opportunity to learn more about people. I'm fascinated by people, and of course, crime is just a really just bizarre expression of human behavior. So I was offered an opportunity to speak to someone like this guy as really a great opportunity to learn. And if I have a future case, I might be able to apply that knowledge. So if you're looking at it in that way, I think it definitely helps. But definitely, some people are built for this kind of work and some aren't. So we saw, for example, when we started to later on employ more psychologists, we had, I think the first two, the sort of second and third one both stayed for 6 months and then left. It just wasn't their cup of tea, and it's great that they got out, because if they'd stayed longer, that would have had horrible impact. And I do think, I mean, there is a toll, no matter even if you are the right mindset for this work. I think it does impact upon you in various ways. I definitely felt that the workload was insurmountable. It was just too much work to get to everything. And that was, for me, the biggest pressure, was this permanent anxiety, like a little engine running in your chest the whole time, and neck pain and this and headaches, because there was just too much work and you couldn't get to everything. And then the next case comes in and the next case comes in. So that was always, for me, very stressful, not so much the content of the work, like the weird things we saw. So yeah, I think just the right people who have the right mindset. But also, I think what's just as important is when you start the work, that you're working with people who can mentor you and guide you and support you, and that you can talk to. And that's what, at least in the beginning of the unit, we were very much a close-knit group of people who worked together, and we liked each other, and we shared, I guess, everything. We were friends. And that was a good support system. So if you don't have that, that's why when we interviewed Kirsten Clark last week, I think it was, or it was the week before, the weeks fly by, I've said I felt very sorry for her, because when she joined, she was the only psychologist. The rest of us had left, and they didn't have anybody supporting her. And then she was down in Cape Town. She wasn't even at the head office with Yanni and Elmarie, who were old hands who could guide and support. And I think that doesn't help. Yeah. The other question I saw Helen had that I think is really good is, do you always do a pointing out irrespective? So yeah, if you arrest a suspect, you're always going to interview them. And if they want to do a pointing out, they want to do a confession, you immediately do it. You try not to delay it at all, because people change their mind overnight. And you never assume that because the guy says, you guys have caught me, I did it, yes, and I'm going to plead guilty. 99% of the time, they do not plead guilty. So you strike while the iron is hot. You always, even if they still maintain they're going to plead guilty, you process that DNA, you look for all the clues you can. You still build your case as if this guy is talking bullshit, because probably he is talking bullshit and won't plead guilty. So you don't want to find that out 6 months down the line and you haven't done your job in the meantime. You always proceed, a good detective would proceed as if this person is not going to plead guilty at court.
Okay. Just on your comments earlier, I just wanted to highlight this comment from MB. Compartmentalization 101. Hats off to all involved dealing with this. This would haunt me to no end. Dr. Jared, if you care to share what your coping mechanisms dealing with these kinds of cases are, I think you kind of covered that. But if there's anything you wanted to just add.
Yeah, like I said, definitely the feeling of camaraderie and the clinical inquisitiveness was helpful. Sadly, as work got a lot more busy, I stopped doing things like going to gym, which I definitely am a big fan of, using physical exercise, even if it's walking every day with your dog or just around the block a couple of times. A huge fan of physical exercise to help deal with anxiety and stress. Some people would have a therapist they go see. That's fantastic. I mean, why not? And, probably I never did see a psychologist during this time. And as I said, I think for me, my colleagues were my debrief, but maybe checking in with a professional every now and then wouldn't have been a bad thing. So physical exercise, in addition to what I've said before, I think a good relationship is helpful. I mean, in any case, when you're stressed in life, if you've got a good partner who's supportive of you, or at least good friends, I mean, that not to lose that with people that you care about. And I think that the risk in these kind of jobs where you're incredibly busy all the time, I mean, from 7 a.m. till 10, 12 at night, I would be busy with a short break, come home, eat dinner, etc. I'd literally be busy for a 20-hour day almost sometimes. That you just stop doing the things that are important, which is connecting with friends, watching a TV show that doesn't have anything to do with people dying, remembering that there's good out there, being out there, as I said, exercising, and just keep in touch with what keeps us normal.
Yeah. Sunshine Girl asked, are there any cases that you still think about in the present day? And just to expand on that, I mean, I know from having been exposed to a lot of crime scene photography, etc., the unedited stuff, that there are definitely things that I struggle to, that just pop into my mind every now and again, and it's not pleasant. There's images that just kind of just stay with you. Do you have that?
Definitely after I left the police, the one case that really stuck with me was Andrea Fenter, that had been murdered by her ex-boyfriend that fled to Brazil. Because I just always felt that's one I just want to see solved. And thank goodness it was. And COVID, he was brought back from Brazil, 2022 convicted. So that stayed with me for that reason up until that point. I wanted to see him convicted. And also, I've actually become, I think, quite good friends with his mom. So I have regular contact, almost sometimes daily contact with his mom. So that's one case that still lingers now for a nice reason, that justice was served, that he's in jail. Andrea's, father, unfortunately, her mom passed away before the guy was brought back and convicted, but the dad got to see his daughter's killer put in jail. And, and Gerard's mom has really come a long way herself in dealing with this and was very helpful for us. And so that's kind of a nice ending off case that I still think about. But, I really try in a way not to. I don't definitely sit and, when I'm at the gym swimming, ponder about old cases. I definitely, when I left the cops, I definitely had about a year where I didn't want to have anything to do with anything related to crime. And it was really only until about 2020 that I even started to do expert witness work. From 2016 until 2020, I just focused on my threat assessment business, consulting to corporates. And only kind of, like I said, 2020, the writing of the book, 2021 started to do a little bit of expert witness work. And where now I do maybe once a month take on an expert witness criminal case. But even now I can feel that I'm kind of getting to a point where I almost feel like I'm stepping too much back into it sometimes.
And 2019, when this really handsome, cool dude called Paul came to find you in Pretoria and say, let's start talking about some of the stuff that you used to do.
Yeah. Good, bad timing, depending on what perspective you have. Yeah.
Well, yeah, exactly. Most people will say bad timing. Most people around me would say bad timing, I'm sure. Anyway, okay, let's talk about the wrap up of this case, what happened. And then I want to talk a little bit about Stewart today. And one of our favorite topics, of course, parole. But let's just first of all talk about the sentence.
Pierre asked about parole, So, sentence, that's a good question. I would assume, to be honest with you, I don't actually have it on hand. I think he would have gotten life sentences because these were premeditated murders. Mm-hmm. But back in those days, a life sentence, the minimum detention period was 20 years, if I'm not mistaken.
So I have it here, Gerard. He confessed to 12 murders. He was convicted on 7. So he was found guilty of the first victim in 1990, the 16-year-old boy, Virginia Geisman. He was found guilty of in 1990. Mercia Pappenfuss, guilty. Then 2 boys that he was found not guilty on. And then, anyway, so 12 murders, convicted on 7. To answer that. Yes. So,
as I said, we probably would have got a life sentence, life sentences. They would be running concurrently. And I know for a fact was it 2 years ago, Paul, that he was up for parole. I'd like to think he didn't get it. I just don't think it's a good idea. But I mean, like anybody, you get a certain period in time in your sentence when you are eligible to have hearings for parole. It doesn't mean you're going to get it. He will, like I said, I think it was 2-3 years ago, so he would probably up for his next round of parole hearings. And the scary thing is, if he's being well behaved in prison, and he's done whatever generic courses there are, they would probably give him parole. I would not put it beyond them to give him parole.
Yeah. Thank you for the super sticker, Shelley. I do recall when we spoke about this case the first time, when we were just doing the audio version of the podcast, and I was looking for it earlier, but I couldn't find it, and I will try to see if I can dig it up. But we had a lady drop us a message on Facebook who'd said that she'd spent a number of months with Stewart in prison doing, on some kind of a religious type course, and that essentially she was said that, he was saved and he was fixed, kind of thing. He was healed by the Lord. So that was the last concrete piece of information that we had. I also heard, and I mean, this is just a rumor, but again, just something that came up as a possible in our research when we were doing the TV shows, is that there's work programs in prison, and that Stewart may have been allowed to leave the prison at certain times to perform certain tasks and what have you. Not confirmed. We can't. I mean, it's speculation. But if anyone out there actually has solid information on anything related, please do share that information with us. Yeah. But you gotta get like you say, you get the feeling that eventually, he's going to be having regular parole hearings now. Eventually, it's very feasible that he could be out. I mean, this is not, we don't find ourselves in a situation like in, say, the States where these guys are very unlikely to ever be released. But here, there is a possibility of it.
Yeah, I think what my biggest bugbear with parole boards, besides that there's no professionals sitting on the parole boards, it's lay people, is that they forget about that a sentence is about punishment and justice. Yeah. They seem to only focus on, is he rehabilitated? Has he been a good boy? That's part of what a punishment is about. Can you ever been punished for murdering 7 people, of which a bunch of them were little children? And because our sentences run concurrently, and I see the comments about that issue, I have big issues with that. I don't think you should run concurrently. I think that if we know that this murder was 1 year and this one was 3 years later and this one was 4 years later, those sentences should start at equal periods in time apart. Otherwise, if you're going to run concurrently, and essentially it's the same as if you get 1 life sentence, it's the same time period if you get 10 life sentences. That can't be right. No, I'm sorry. And as I said, the parole boards don't think about, you just need to be punished for what you did. It doesn't matter whether you're rehabilitated within a year. Does that mean you should be released back into society? Absolutely not. It's about the punishment and deterrence.
And surely, if you've done certain things like cannibalism, if you've eaten someone, if you've committed necrophilia, things like this, which are really serious things to have done, surely these are also. Does the science not say that there's no fixing some of these issues, really?
And also, you're living in an incredibly structured environment of a prison where you're not exposed to your victimology. Yeah. How can that be a predictor of how you're going to cope in the outside world when you have to do everything for yourself, survive, you have relationships, interact with people, and you're exposed to women and children? I mean, it's like just bizarre to think that the prison is a good predictor of how you're going to behave outside when you're not exposed to your victims. That's just stupid.
No, if you keep a kid out of the candy store, they're not going to have candy. But if you let them back in the candy store, they're going to be filling up their bags.
Yeah.
Just on the parole again, MB, do you know why hasn't the Justice Department revised parole boards and parole requirements yet? The emails to ministers fall on deaf ears, and parolees that reoffend stats are scary.
I just think, like many things, sadly, in our government services, that just things are just the wheels are falling off the bus. And I don't know. I don't know, to be honest with you. I know the ministers have always promised there's going to be a revamp. Okay, so when?
Yeah.
When are you even going to just call a collection of experts together and say, let's start the conversation and then chart a way forward? Then there's very simple things you can do even right now, like polygraphs on every single parole board member. Have you ever taken money to release someone? Lifestyle audits. I mean, they're not even looking for the possibility of corruption on the parole board members. I mean, why wouldn't? If you can release someone halfway through their sentence, if it's a sentence, you're telling me there's not going to be corruption at that point?
Yeah.
So if you're not looking for it, you're allowing it to happen. There's no consequences if a parole board releases someone and then they reoffend. I mean, I don't even think there's a review. Let's look at the reports. Let's look at what was recommended. Because I know psychologists at correctional services who say, we write reports saying that these guys are a huge danger and they shouldn't be released. And surprise, surprise, we hear the guy's released. So you know what? I think if a guy reoffends, there must be a review of that hearing, a review of the material. And if there was recommendations that the person shouldn't be released and the parole board did, I think if we start to hold the parole board accountable, you'll see how few people get parole. If we start to make them civilly accountable to be sued or in a private capacity, then I think we'll see things change. But there's no consequences for these people if they make a bugger up.
Yeah. Let me just have a look here. Shelley asked, how does one get on a parole board? Maybe we should apply.
I think they advertise positions, as far as I know, when there are vacancies, and they'll have like members of the public. As I said, there's no professionals. There aren't psychologists and social workers and criminologists on the parole boards. There'll be get by here on the parole board. You'll have the CMC, which is a correctional services body underneath it. That's where the psychologists and social workers, they gather the basic information, do assessments, and they give all of that information to the parole board. But it's a layperson who's reading that psychologist's report and the social worker's report and making the finding, yeah, we think this person's rehabilitated or not. If not, what therapy they should have further. I mean, how can a layperson say, okay, you must go back for therapy about this issue? It's like me telling an orthopedic surgeon what he should do with the surgery of a knee. I mean, how the hell would I know? Yeah. So it's just bizarre, in my opinion, how these things work. I mean, it also starts off with the fact that when someone arrives at the prison, they don't have the case file. It's not like the docket or the court judgment and sentencing goes with them to the correctional services. So that all correctional services get is, okay, you've been convicted of 1 times murder and your sentence is 20 years. Yeah. They don't know like the details unless it's a high profile case. Yeah. So you have people who don't actually even know exactly why the person's here in terms of what kind of murder he committed. And I mean, we spoke about the Welkom case about 2-3 weeks ago or last week. And that was 1 murder. Oscar Pistorius was also 1 murder. But I mean, those are vastly different kinds of people you're dealing with. One's not a risk really, Oscar, and the other ones are a massive risk. Mm. So if you don't understand the exact content of what happened, at least having the judgment, which summarizes all the evidence, and the sentence remarks from the court, let alone the docket, ideally, and the judgments and the sentence stuff. Correctional services are starting with a massive handicap in terms of understanding what the hell this guy did and what we should do about it.
Yeah. Lauren makes an interesting point here. We have a murder parolee that is now back in our small town that causes trauma for a family member. He did 7 years of 15. We don't think he will reoffend in the same way, but it's such a re-trauma. And that's interesting. Not only someone being paroled when maybe they shouldn't be is difficult enough, but then they're being released and very possibly going back into the community where they offended and creating, there's a ripple effect surely in that community. Yeah. And does the community not have a right not to, have to deal with that kind of re-trauma, if you like?
Problem is, if you're granted parole, most people will be given parole at some point, even life sentenced people. And, unfortunately, you have to have someone who's prepared to take the person in, such as a family member or a friend. And if that's where that person is and it's back in that community, I mean, I can understand how upsetting that must be for the family. Yeah. But that's unfortunately what it is. In some murderers, it's probably not a risk. Other ones like Boetie and the Welkom guys, that is a massive risk to have them back in the community. Yeah.
Sunshine Girl asked, has anyone gotten a life sentence without parole in South Africa? To which we remind you that there is no such thing as a life sentence without parole.
In South Africa.
In South Africa.
Yeah, it's a good question. And the only reason why so when we did away with a death sentence, and they were looking at the concept of a life sentence to replace it, it only met constitutional requirements if there was a possibility of parole at some point. Otherwise, it was seen as a cruel and unusual punishment to put someone in jail forever until they die without the possibility of parole. So that's why, no, we will never get life without parole in South Africa because it would be deemed as unconstitutional. And as I said, if we're doing parole properly and we're doing proper assessments by competent people on the parole and competent people on the parole boards, we should be keeping people quite easily into late until they're very, very old or they're going to die in prison. People who've committed crimes like this. But no, it is not possible in South Africa to have life without parole.
And I think that's where we leave this case tonight, Gerard. Your final thoughts on Stewart the Boetie Boer Wilken?
Just always be. I don't know if we'll have somebody like him soon. I hope not. So that even how many years later, it's almost 30 years later, still a very unique guy. Never had someone like him in my time, in the cases I worked on. So, Just yeah, fascinating. I definitely watched the documentary we put together, which you're going to upload. And if you're interested in that, then of course the longer Boer series that interviewed family members, etc., his surviving children. So just a really,
were you involved
case.
were you on the Showmax documentary, Jared?
Yeah, I mean that whole documentary is centered around my interview that was done with him.
Okay, cool. Because I haven't actually had a chance to see it yet myself, so I think this will inspire me to do that. It's also, I find it a little bit difficult when you're working on crime a lot to then kind of put it on your social calendar of sitting down watching true crime for entertainment purposes. I get that. I mean, not to the same degree as you, but I do understand that. Thanks to everyone for joining in the chat. We really appreciate you. Thank you for contributing your questions and your comments. A really nice discussion tonight on the chat, and we appreciate it. Thank you for your super likes as well. We remind you to please become a member of the channel and to subscribe. We're trying to get to 10,000 subscribers, and then, like Helen said earlier, on to 100,000 from there. We appreciate you taking the time to join us. Like I said, later in the week, we will be posting our first episode of South African Serial on the Stewart Wilken case. So check that out. You saw some clips from that program tonight over the course of the show. So please do check that out. And then also, one last thing, please do head over to That Rugby Union. At That Rugby Union on YouTube, we've started a weekly rugby podcast as well, hosted by my bud Ola and Chinga. And so we'd invite you to go check that out too if you're a crime and rugby fan, which I'm sure there are plenty of. Thank you, Gerard. We'll be back next week with a guest, and we'll give you some more information about that in the course of the week on the channel as well. We appreciate you. I appreciate you, Gerard. Thank you very much, as always, for bringing your expertise.
Thank you.
And thank you for all your questions, everybody. We will see you again this time next week.
With a foreign guest, not just a guest.
Yes. Do you want to actually tease? Do you want to do a little? Do you want to go?
Yes.
Explain. Let's do. I wasn't going to jump the gun.
Someone that
if you're happy to.
Someone I got to know many, many years ago in the early 2000s when I started doing profiling work for the police. I was overseas and I met Helena Hakkanen. She's a professor in psychology, and she was basically a profiler in Finland and a prolific researcher of violent crime. And she subsequently has left doing that job. Just released her own book, which unfortunately at this point is only available in Finnish language. But she is going to speak to us next week about her career and some of the stuff she's worked on and being a profiler in a totally different context in a different world. So that should be really, really interesting.
Amazing. Yeah. It's going to be wonderful. And hopefully, as we're growing, we're looking to do more of that, bring in guests from around the world, some of your network and friends from different parts of the planet. And also some fellow local crime content creators as well. We're going to be bringing onto the show in the next couple of weeks to talk to them about their journeys in the true crime space and what it is they're passionate about in the space, and maybe talk about a few cases with them as well. Because, I think now that we've kind of settled with the weekly podcast, we really want to spread our wings a little bit and start connecting to the broader crime community, true crime community out there. So lots to look forward to on Profiler Africa. I always enjoy my Tuesday nights hanging out with Gerard, and I hope you do too. We'll see you again next week, and don't forget, everyone, to just keep looking over those shoulders, okay?
I am a human being and I killed human beings.
Before I knew it, I'd fired 4 shots at the door. I kept on shouting for Eva to phone the police.
Tests are underway to determine if a serial killer is on the loose in Centurion, Pretoria.
The dead won't bother you. It's the living you gotta worry about.